Hey, what's up guys? My name's Shane, and my goal with this video is for it to be one of the, if not the best resource out there for estimating interior paint jobs. I normally don't like to brag or boast, but I feel like I'm very credible and confident to be able to talk about this. I've done well over 8 figures in painting, thousands upon thousands of interior paint jobs. I've got a solid 18 years of experience, but not only that, I've really taken the time to measure things, quantify them, and analyze it. So that's why I feel confident in making this video and telling you everything I'm about to go over. So this will be a little bit of a longer video, but I really want to make sure I answer a lot of the common questions I get and just do a really good, thorough job explaining how I estimate, why I estimate that way, and why I think, in my opinion, this is the best way to estimate, to have accuracy, be able to do it fast, and have a repeatable, measurable process. All right, so when it comes to estimating, we're essentially going to measure out up to 9 things. It depends on the job, what we're going to be bidding, but the 9 things that we're going to measure is walls, ceilings, baseboards. We're going to count the number of door frames, number of doors, and mark are we doing one side or both sides. We're going to count windows, and then the 3 other to make it 9 are what I just batch in miscellaneous. That's either measured by linear footage, square footage, or by units. So for the miscellaneous, like linear footage, something you could measure that way would be railings. For the miscellaneous square footage, something you could measure that way would be like a particular type of shelving. And then something that would be measured in units would be like stair risers. So like we would count each individual riser that we're gonna paint. So when we go to do a estimate, we're gonna be measuring those things, and I just like to put them into a spreadsheet. The reason I put them in a spreadsheet is that's essentially a giant calculator. And rather than adding things up each individual time, you can just have the formulas pre-built in your spreadsheet so that it just does all the math for you and it does it the same way every single time. All right, so let's talk about what kind of math are we doing once we have those measurements. Really what we're trying to do is break down this big paint job into little chunks that are standardized or the same amount per chunk. Now it gets really difficult to decide, like, what do we chunk it into? And something that's easy for people to understand and comprehend is hours. So like, how much can I do in 1 hour? But if only it was that simple. So what I've done is I've actually had somebody literally watch people paint for weeks and literally wrote down every single task that they did and how long each task took. And what you'll find if you do this is that people paint at different rates. And I wouldn't say that it's necessarily like if this guy's slow, he's a bad painter or does better quality or anything like that. It's just a simple fact that people are different. You know, if you're 6'6", you're probably going to be able to paint faster than somebody that's 5'6". If you've been painting for 20 years, you're probably going to be quicker than somebody who just started painting a year ago. Between people, it can be really, really big. I'm talking at least 2 to even 3x difference, to where it takes this guy who does the exact same process twice as long as this guy, but they're both experienced, really good painters. So that's where it gets hard to say, well, like, how long should this take per hour? We refined and changed our standards based on what we saw in reality. And the big point I'm trying to make here is my standards are going to be for a slightly below average experienced painter, which I know that's a mouthful, but somebody that I would say is an actual painter, not somebody who has painted a bedroom and thinks they're a painter now, but somebody who's actually worked as a painter for more than 6 months. That's what I mean by an experienced painter. And I would say slightly below average, that is what my standards are based off of. But I've got painters who will blow those standards out of the water and it'll be perfect. No touch-ups, amazing quality. So this is just one of the many nuances that come with painting. But I wanted to explain, rather than saying this is how much you should do per hour, I like to think of it as these are chunks. And based on these chunks, there's a fair and reasonable amount to pay for each chunk, which really makes a lot of sense if you're subcontracting, because you're not paying an hourly rate. You're just saying, hey, if you get this much done, I'll pay you this much. And we try to just make it even, right? So it's like, I don't care if I'm doing this or this. If I'm getting paid this much, I'm indifferent of which task I do because they're both about the same to me in terms of effort, time, that sort of thing. So there's another huge thing that comes into play when trying to determine how much time something should take, and that's the process that you use to complete the task. An easy example would be if we're painting baseboard trim. One painter might say, hey, I'm gonna freehand all of this and just cut that line with a brush by hand. Where another painter says he's gonna use tape that off, seal the edge of that tape, paint it, and then come back and remove that tape to get a nice, clean, crisp line. That's two different processes, and usually if you freehand it and don't tape off the trim, you're generally gonna be a little bit quicker. So that's where it really depends on what process are you using. So the way I like to estimate interior especially is with the assumption that, hey, we're gonna do this in a very particular process. This is our SOP, or standard operating procedure. Like, this is how we like to do it. I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong or that you should do it this way. I'm just saying we have to decide on a process in order to have standards or production rates or whatever you want to call them. We're going to come back to that in a minute, but I just wanted to start to explain to you some of the nuances when it comes to estimating and why you'll see and hear different things out there. All right, so on my spreadsheet, I have a page dedicated to all of those standards where we just have them in different columns and we just put down all of the different ones we have. And we even leave room at the bottom so we can add more as we learn more and new things come up. And I've reiterated and adjusted these standards plenty of times, and I've added new ones just as I learn and go on. Okay, so now that we've measured stuff, we want to say, hey, what are we actually painting? And when I say what, I mean two different things. One being, what type of wall are we painting? What type of ceiling, right? Is it a vaulted ceiling? Is it a popcorn ceiling? Is it a 1-story or 2-story? Are we going to be doing the same color or change color? So for each of those 9 things, we pick what type of walls, ceilings, baseboards, windows, door frames, doors, and the other miscellaneous stuff. And then the other what is in the, let's say it's a house. Like, are we painting 1 bedroom? Are we painting the whole house, just the kitchen? So we need to go through and figure out, well, what are we going to measure? And then sometimes a client will say, hey, I want to know 2 options. How much is it for just the kitchen? And then how much more would it be if I included the kitchen, living room, and dining room? So we need to know, like, what are we bidding? So in my spreadsheet, after I've measured it, I put it on this sheet here. And then I go through and I pick what kind of walls, what kind of ceiling, what kind of windows, what kind of doors. And then I have 9 different tabs that all look like this one. And those are the different areas. And usually I'll separate those areas based on like the options someone wants to see or just what makes sense. If it's an open floor plan, I'll probably group the entryway, living room, kitchen, dining room, and then each bedroom I'll separate out just for simplicity and easiness, and I'll label them so that if I come back 2 months later and look at this, it's easy for me to understand what I did and how I measured it. A side note with that is we take tons of pictures of every job and we put them all into a folder, and that is for that reason, is so that we can come back to this 6 months later when we've forgotten everything about it and reconstruct it. Okay, and then those 9 different areas of the house that I measured out those things all get pulled into this one sheet where I can just turn rooms on or off and turn the individual things within the rooms on or off with a check mark. So I can quickly decide, like, okay, if they want just the kitchen, it's this much. Kitchen, dining room, living room, it's this much. If we remove the ceiling from the dining room but keep it on everything else, it's this much. So you can quickly like figure those kind of things out. And this is where it gets really complicated. We learned that there's a lot of steps that go into painting, and depending on which checkboxes are on or what you're painting are going to affect what steps you actually do. So I know there's more than 3 steps, but I'm trying to make it easy to understand. You've got 3 steps for the baseboards, 3 steps for the walls. But if you turn both of those on, it's not actually 6 steps. You actually lose a step, and it's only 5 steps. And that step that could get double counted is when you create the line between the baseboard and the wall. Because think about it, if you paint the baseboards first, you don't have to worry about that line. You can just get paint on your walls. If you like spray them, you can get overspray on the wall. But when you do paint the walls, you want to make sure you don't get paint on that freshly new painted trim. So that's what I mean by those 3 steps turns into 5, because you lose that, make the line between the wall and the baseboards on one of them. Now what I've tried to do to make my sheet really fast and easy and simple to use is we're just going to put in those measurements, and the calculator is going to take those other things into account so that you don't have to put in those extra standards like, oh, I need to put in the standard creating the line at the bottom of the wall. I need to put in the standard for creating the line at the bottom of the baseboards, and I need to know how many of those to add in and stuff. It's going to do all that with logic, with the calculator, so that it's kind of out of mind, out of sight, and to make it easier, mainly so we can be really fast. So another thing with the process, right, is what if we're going to paint the walls and the ceilings the same color and the same sheen, so we're going to use the exact same paint? Well, then that whole step of creating that line between the two disappears and is no longer this time-consuming thing. So also in each room, we have that option there to where you can say, hey, we're making the walls and the ceilings the same color, or the walls and the baseboards the same color. All right, so based on what we're painting, as well as all the measurements, the sheet is going to act like a calculator and figure out how much time all of that's going to take. And it will take a few things into account based on the measurements, such as how much setup cleanup time is there going to be. And like if we are going to be painting the ceiling, we need more time to mask off the floor, stuff like that. But it's going to basically figure out how many chunks of time is this job going to take based on all those inputs. Again, like a number of hours for a slightly below average experienced painter, and then it's going to multiply that by an amount of money, right? So if you think about it with employees and hours, it's going to multiply it by the wage. So if it's $20 an hour, your wage would be 20. Now the wage will change over time, right? Inflation, wages go up slightly. If you're in a really densely populated city where everything is more expensive, your wage is going to be higher than if you're in a small town where services tend to be more affordable and the wage is generally lower. So it's hard to tell you, how much you should be charging. But one thing you can ask yourself is, what is a good average wage for a painter, or a slightly below average experienced painter? This is what we are using right now for what our wage is. Again, the area I am in is in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado. Now, you've got your wage, but you also need to incorporate something called burden. And if you're running employees, that would be payroll taxes, workers' comp, and then any other thing related to paying, like if you have some kind of retirement, like 401k or simple IRA plan, or if you provide health insurance for them or anything like that, you want to incorporate that with the wage because that's your actual total labor cost. If you're running subcontractors, you just need to make sure and check with your local laws and regulations if there's any burden you have to pay there, and make sure you include that if needed. All right, so now we've got our total labor cost, but there's also the material cost. The materials is usually just your paint and your sundries. Sundries are like paper, plastic, tape, caulk, all that sort of stuff. Now, because we have the measurements and because we know how much paint tends to cover on average, we can do the calculations to figure that out. Most paint in the instructions is going to say it covers a certain amount. The most common is 300 to 400 square foot per gallon for one coat. But what you might find surprising is some products will actually say, hey, I actually cover less than that. But that coverage amount kind of gives us a relativeness of like, hey, does this paint cover more than this paint in terms of how many gallons I'm going to need to use and that sort of thing. But again, we just put that into our spreadsheet. How much it costs per gallon, what does it say the max it covers on the can, and then based on that, we can figure out how much paint we use based on past experiences. The amount it says on the can, that's best case scenario with one coat that never covers, so it doesn't always work out that way. But we know based on experience about how much it's going to take. And then based on how much area and how much paint we're using, we can get a relative good idea of how much the sundries are going to cost and figure out how much we're going to spend on materials as a whole. We're going to incorporate the stuff like the sales tax. In my area, they charge us a recycling fee for buying paint. We're going to include all that to get our total material cost. All right, so we've totaled up all the labor. We've totaled up all of the materials. We're accounting for taxes, cleanup, everything. We've got the total complete cost of those two things. And we're going to add those up. But then there's a lot of other costs that are associated with the business. Like you've got insurance, maybe an office, maybe a vehicle. Maybe you have to pay office staff or salespeople or production managers, all these other things. So you want to account for all that. You also want to account for making money, right? If you did all this for free, you'd go out of business. So we take that cost and we mark it up. And the easiest way to conceptualize and think about this is The way you mark it up is you're going to divide it by a percentage. And the percentage that you want to divide it by is what you want your labor and materials to be as a percentage of the job. For example, if you want your labor and materials to add up to 60% of the job, then you'd figure out that total cost and you'd divide it by 60% or 0.6. And that's how you would get your price. All right, so now that you got a price, the last thing the calculator can help you do is determine any kind of taxes that are associated. Luckily, where I live, for services, we don't have to pay taxes. What I mean by that is if you buy like a gallon of milk at the grocery store, the gallon's like, $3, but then you look at the receipt and you actually paid like $3.24. It's because of taxes. In some areas, you do have to pay taxes on services. Another thing is, what if you want to offer a discount? You can put that into your calculator and adjust for that and be able to see how the numbers work out. All right, so now I want to get into some more nuanced things with the actual standards, right? So I'm going to cover those different standards and just give you some tidbits of information from my experience over the years based on questions I get and stuff. So when it comes to walls, we separate it by whether it's a textured wall, meaning knockdown or orange peel, or if it's a smooth wall. And there's different kinds of walls, even that. There's like troweled walls that aren't necessarily too smooth, and there's like the level 5 finish. And you could break it down more if you want to. That's just how I've chosen to break it down. A big misconception, or sometimes I find people are confused on or surprised by, is that what do you think actually would take more time, painting a textured wall or painting a smooth wall? And based on our experience, we would say that a smooth wall takes more time, which especially for people that don't have as much experience and stuff, that is not what they would have expected. And I think part of it is, you could argue, yeah, you're going to use less paint on the wall, but the cost of paint doesn't make much up of the price. Paint's usually coming in 10 to 15% of the job, where the rest is labor. And on like a smooth level 5 finish wall, it's more difficult to paint. You really have to make sure that you're putting the paint on evenly, especially when there's a sheen. If you have a high enough sheen, you can actually have issues where if they dry at different rates, you get like little inconsistencies in the sheen. Also, when you're rolling it, you'll tend to use a thinner nap, and you want to roll it all off in the same direction so that the little bit of stipple all looks the same. They're little minute details, but that's why it takes longer. Even on sometimes the level 5 finish, you'll end up sanding between coats to get that really good finish. But that's why smooth walls are actually more complicated than textured walls. The whole reason they do the texture and the knockdown is to hide imperfections and make it a lot smoother and easier. You can just roll it on. You don't have to worry about, oh, it's thicker here, thinner here. It's just, does the color all look uniform and the same? You can use a thicker nap, which allows you to have more paint in the actual roller, which means you don't have to dip as much. And you can get a lot done before you have to dip, and you can just go faster and not have to worry about it as much. Another thing with walls is, on my spreadsheet, I've got a standard for paint and prime new drywall, and that'll automatically add in the cost of primer, and we'll tell it what kind of primer we want to use. But something to be aware of when you go to paint new drywall, you want to have really good expectations with whoever you're painting that wall for. And if the wall is not going to look good after you paint it because the texture isn't good or the tape isn't good, don't paint it. You'll want to tell the GC or the homeowner or whoever it is, like, hey, I'm concerned that if I paint that, you're not going to like the way it looks afterwards. And another pro tip, I would put that in a text or an email, because on a job site, things are moving fast. You might say that and the guy's not going to remember. But if you put it in writing, you'll be able to use that, because if they tell you to go ahead anyway, it's like, hey, I just want to make sure that you're going to be okay with this, because you can tell that this isn't going to fly. It's not going to look good. And the lines get blurred, like, well, painter versus drywaller. And I've just seen that issue come up a lot. So if there's any doubt in your mind that it's not going to look good after you paint it because the drywall and texture isn't good, then bring that point up before you paint it, and it's best to just try to get out of it. I know it stinks. You've got a whole week worth of work. Your guys show up, and then we can't paint. Now you got guys that are upset because they're not getting their 40 hours a week or whatever, but it's going to hurt a lot more when it turns into an issue if you don't address it immediately. There's other things with like commercial and walls. A lot of times there is no baseboard. They'll use that rubber base there, and if that's the case, it's actually going to take a lot less time. You don't have that step of creating the line at the bottom of the wall. So if you're trying to be as competitive as possible, I would remove those hours from your estimate. Same thing if you're painting a ceiling and there is no floor in there, if it's new construction, I would have a different price there. You can remove the time it takes to mask the floor and make sure you're not getting paint on the floor. All right, now a huge question I get a lot of times when it comes to the walls, people ask, hey, do you remove windows? Do you remove doors? And the answer is we used to say, no, we don't remove anything. We just count it as if it's all a wall. And the thought process behind that was, well, yeah, we're not painting that area, but the amount of time to mask off the window and paint around it is going to be similar to just painting it as if it was a wall. There will be a little bit of a difference in paint used, but it's not that much paint, so it's not really worth figuring all that out. What we found from painting is the windows actually add more time. So when we had a window that's just a vinyl window where none of the actual window gets painted, we used to just not count those, but now we count them because we found when we were looking at jobs, we're like, why are these jobs that have similar amounts of surface area taking longer? And it was because of the windows. Because it takes a long time to tape off all the vinyl on the window, cut around it, and then paint around it. That actually takes more time than if it was just a wall that you could just roll. So now we actually count all windows to account for that sort of thing. But we don't count doors. And again, there's no right or wrong way to do it, but the reason is with a door, there's usually maybe 3 doors tops. It's usually 1 to 3 doors in a room. Sometimes there's no doors in a room. So the idea is it's not worth the extra time to add things and calculate things for what you get out of it. Like the juice isn't worth the squeeze is our belief, because we didn't really notice a big difference. Like that wasn't why, oh, this house had so many doors that we had to paint around is why it was off. But windows, on the other hand, yeah, there could be a room that has like 10 windows, and that does make a big difference. But that's why we do include windows even if we're not painting anything, but we don't include the doors if we're not painting it. One side tangent on materials and how many coats it takes to cover and stuff. That's a pretty big topic, but that's why in my standards, I don't say 1 coat or 2 coats. I like to say same color or change color. Because in reality, sometimes change color, it might take 3 coats. And how you handle that in your business is your decision. A lot of times when we do the estimate, we don't know what paint colors they're gonna select. But we do like to tell the client, like, hey, you're gonna pay this no matter what. If we end up having to put 3 coats on, we won't change the price on you. But the other way of doing it, which is very popular, very common, again, there's no right or wrong way, is you can say, hey, I'm gonna bid it for 2 coats because I don't know what color you're using. If you pick a color and product that ends up taking 3, I'm gonna have to charge you extra for that last coat. And as long as you are upfront and set that expectation with your clients, you shouldn't really have many issues, but that's another common question that I get. Another common question with coats and colors and gallons is how do you account for when somebody wants to use, 5 different colors? And again, a lot of that is about expectation setting and going over the scope of work when you're at the estimate. But on our contract that's built right into my spreadsheet, we're actually gonna put the number of colors we're bidding for, because usually at the estimate they at least know that, and then that way we can anchor that in so that at a later time if they say, hey, I want to use 5 colors instead of 3, we could say, okay, well the contract says 3, so we're gonna have to change it and make a change order, which usually they understand, like, yeah, that's going to change the price. When it comes to actually bidding, there's 2 ways we account for that. One of the standards under the miscellaneous linear footage is called accent wall line cutting. And what that is creating the line. If you have a bedroom and one of the walls is going an accent color, on each side of the wall, you've got to create that nice, clean, crisp line. So that's what we're measuring. For instance, if it's an 8-foot wall, it would be 8 on this side, 8 on this side for a total of 16. When we put that into our giant calculator or spreadsheet, it knows, hey, I need to add another gallon of paint, because even though this room isn't going to take 2 gallons, because there's 2 colors, we're going to have to get 2 gallons. Now, if the whole room is going one color, like say we're painting 3 bedrooms, but they're all going to go their own each individual color, you're not necessarily doing any accent wall line cutting, but you are going to need at least 3 gallons of paint. So on the bottom of each one of those pages where we put in those 9 different things, there's also one called other. And this we use all the time for random things that doesn't make sense for us to add a new standard into, but this just happens. But one thing we'll do is we'll say, hey, additional color, and we'll add 1 gallon and 1 hour. And you might be wondering, why would you add an hour? And the main reason for that is, it's more work, more things to keep track of more brushes and rollers to clean. So that's why we add the extra time. You don't have to add an hour, you could add a half hour. You don't have to add any time at all, but that's how you could easily account for the extra number of gallons. Now, when it comes to ceilings, one of the things that I just recently had to change was, if it's going same color or change color, what I noticed is we end up with same color on the ceilings, using more paint than I would have thought. And I'm not even completely sure as to why. I've got a couple ideas, and it's probably a combination of the two. One is on the ceilings, you're not really having a lot of windows or doors, so it really is the true complete surface area. But then another thing, especially on a lot of these new builds, is they didn't put much paint on the ceiling because it's just white, So it tends to be a super dry, maybe even unsealed completely ceiling where like the wall is like more sealed. And what I mean by that is the paint is going to sit on the surface and not absorb into the wall. So when you go to put paint on there, it's going to take a lot more. All right, baseboards. So a good tip there is, same color is kind of tricky, right? Normally baseboards are white and it's going white again, same color. If you can, I would match the color that's on there because not all whites are created equal. And sometimes if you bid it for same color and you use a different kind of white, it won't cover in one coat. And it's going to end up costing you a lot more time than you bid for. So look out for that. Another thing is you'll learn different kinds of paints behave differently, and some paints are more runny than others. So when you're painting baseboard, especially when it's bigger or it's smooth and flat, some paints you'll actually be a lot more efficient with, not necessarily because of how much it hides or covers, but because of the way it lays on and how it's easier to put it on a little bit thicker and get good coverage, and it smooths out and it's more buttery and less runs. One paint that I know, Pro Classic by Sherwin-Williams, we really don't like to use that on trim because we find that it actually takes more time to apply. So you'll learn those little types of nuances like, hey, what paints to avoid in different kind of applications. Because even though maybe it's a more cost-effective paint, again, labor is the expensive part of the job. And if it takes more labor, you can run into issues. All right, now when it comes to windows, boy, there's a lot of different kinds of windows. And not only that, but there's a lot of different sizes of windows. Now, if you want to, you can totally break up big, medium, small, and you can separate the windows out by that. That's totally fine. The biggest thing with windows is going to be whether it's a vinyl window where what's actually holding and touching the glass, does that get painted? If it doesn't, it's going to be a lot more efficient to paint that than if it's a wood window where that actually gets painted. And if it is a wood window, you should have a good process on like, what exactly do you paint? That could be a whole nother video and subject on like the process and how you do that. But I would set expectations with your clients as well as have a good, SOP of how your company likes to handle that. All right, when it comes to doors, there's different kinds of doors. And again, you want to have that SOP. There's like a 6-panel door that has like texture. Usually you can brush and roll those with a very thin little stipple and you don't really see anything, versus if it's a smooth flat door, super picky homeowner might be expecting and wanting you to spray those doors because they want it to be like an automotive finish where it's just smooth and buttery like glass and completely flat and you can't see any stipple at all. So I wouldn't bring that up at every estimate, but maybe take a look at the door. And if it's like that currently, or the homeowner mentions that to you, you should, set expectations and have on your contract that you're going to brush and roll this or that you're going to spray it, so that if there is an issue later on, you can go back to that point in time or on the contract and say, hey, I totally understand that you were expecting something different, but you can see here, I was expecting to do it this way, and that's why I did it. And, let's come up with a good solution here. And I'll just kind of help them understand, as well as you come up with a better compromise or solution to whatever kind of problems arise. And while I'm on doors, I would definitely say kitchen cabinets. A lot of people ask, like, how come that's not in my spreadsheet? And in my personal opinion, it's two different trades. Yes, it's painting, but kitchen cabinets are way more difficult and complicated than most people think at surface value, which makes total sense. It's like, yeah, I'm painting a door. Why can't I paint a door on the cabinet? And a lot of times that's fine, especially like on rentals or in certain situations. But a lot of times kitchen cabinets can be thought of like refinishing something. And there's totally different processes, totally different products that can be used. So if you're starting out and stuff, my advice would be don't do kitchen cabinets. Give it some time. I know it's tough because in the beginning you're just trying to get every piece of work you can, but I can tell you from my experience as well as many other painters, start with one thing, get really good at that and blow that up. For instance, I didn't do interior painting for years. all we did was exterior, residential repaints, 0 interior. Then I added that on. And I just this year started doing cabinets. So for 14 years, we didn't do cabinets. So just to let you know, like, it is possible. And you just, with production, I think I mentioned this before, but you want it to be a well-oiled machine. You don't want to be having problems. It can just really put a lot of stress on you or the production manager. So sometimes saying no to something that is more complicated and tougher is the better strategy, but to each their own. Just while I was on doors, wanted to mention that. Door frames, there's a lot of different door frames. Most of the time it's a standard cut and dry door frame, but sometimes it's a decorative door frame where at the top, the top of the doors comes out a little bit. Maybe it's, bigger, taller doors than your typical one. There's 3 ways you can address for that. One is you don't do anything and it's not that big of a deal. Sometimes on a job, it's going to be a little bit tougher. You won't make the same margin. 2 is you can just add more time per room just down at the bottom under the other part, or just buffer your job, add a little bit more. Just kind of guess, how many more hours is this going to take for that? Put in something, or create a totally different standard, right? So you can say, large door frames with decorative trim, A, and then B, because sometimes you'll have totally different ones. And when it comes to doors and door frames, another thing that's important is to understand, are you painting both sides? Because on a bedroom, right, and they say, hey, I want the whole bedroom painted and the door, it's important to know, are we just painting one side of the door, or the other side of the door that faces the hallway? Did you want that painted as well? So that's one of those things you need to take into account that we found can make a difference on the time, especially on a commercial job or a big house. And that's especially true for closet doors. A lot of times we'll mention hey, I think you get more value just painting one side of the door. Nobody sees that back side of the door. Do you really want to pay more for that? Or if you don't put that into your estimate and you just kind of leave it bland, the client should expect that, hey, both sides of the doors are going to be painted. All right, and then the miscellaneous, that's where you really get nuanced and it can be difficult. For instance, you could count railings as square footage, linear footage, or even units or items. You could count each individual spindle. You could just measure out the linear footage, or you could measure out the square footage. And there's no right or wrong way. I would just say, in your head, in your area, for us here, there's a normal type of railing that we see, and 80% of the railings are that way. So my standard is for those kind of railings. But if we see a different kind of railing, then again, we'll make adjustments, maybe even make a new standard just for that railing. Or if they have a special request where they're like, hey, I have 2-tone railings and I actually don't want to paint the handrails or the base, I just want to paint each individual standard, then maybe it makes more sense to measure it out by units. And last thing I'll say with the miscellaneous is, for me, again, trying to be very good at one thing, we really don't like to do drywall or any kind of repair. But, people expect that, and we do repairs. For our company, we say, hey, we don't fix anything bigger than a softball. Softball is as big as we go. If it's a basketball, we'll tell you, you're going to be better off hiring a drywaller who has the right tools, right expertise, and experience to do that right. But as a painter, we'll handle softball or smaller. We also set the expectation that when we're done, because we're dealing with knockdown texture and it's really hard to match them exactly, that you're going to see it. It's hey, you're going to see that when we're done. If you get the right angle and stuff, you're going to see it. Are you okay with that? Because if you're not, we shouldn't do the job because we don't want issues. And the way that we bid that is we use that in our miscellaneous, and every hole that needs a little bit of texture and drywall repair, we just count as 1. And then when I put that into my calculator or spreadsheet, for the paint, we're going to use a drywall repair kit, which basically is a can of the texture stuff, some spackle, and the materials needed to handle that. What I'm really going for when I'm deciding what I want to put in versus what I don't is I want to be as simple, accurate, and fast as possible. The more complexity, the more standards and stuff you add into your estimating system, the more thought has to be there, the more time it takes to oh yeah, is it this one, that one, or this? So usually what ends up happening is it can be more accurate, but the cost is simplicity and speed. And if the accuracy is just a little bit, but it adds a ton of time or makes it really complex and harder to teach, then I would say I wouldn't do that. Versus if you get a huge accuracy gain and it's just a little bit of extra time or complexity, then yeah, you'd want to do it. That's how I make my decisions on whether or not I'm going to account for another nuanced thing. And in your calculator, if you're able to make it so the person actually measuring doesn't have to think about it, but it's going to account for it, I would definitely do that and try to make it as easy as possible for yourself or whoever's going to be doing the estimate. And to be honest, there really is no substitute for experience. I'm sure I'll get a lot of guys in the comments that are like, the way I estimate is I go look at the job, I can tell how long it's going to take, and I give them a bid based on that number. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's just experience, and there's no substitute for experience. You can't just teach somebody new that. But that's what I'm saying is I have a lot of experience. I've actually taken the time to see many different painters, and I've written all this stuff down because my memory is horrible. If I just went off of memory, I wouldn't be very good at it, but I've jotted it down so I can try to tackle this idea of we should be able to estimate every job and know how much labor and materials it's going to take to complete it. All right, so when it comes to estimating, I think it's important to give you the process my company uses, at least the steps that will affect the amount of time something's going to take. Again, I'm not saying this is the right way. I'm just saying this is the way that I found to do it. And I'll go into a little bit of a tangent here, again, because I'm really trying to give you the best value possible. The reason we do it this way is I found this is the best way to do it to make production go smooth. Because the worst thing when you're a production manager doing production is when there's an issue, right? So if we can use a process and that process only 5% of the time we have an issue with the client versus this process 20% of the time we have an issue with the client, we're gonna go with the process that has less issues. So when you paint the interior, creating straight lines is important, and there's a lot of different lines that you'll create. And you can do it by taping. We call it tape caulking, where we actually tape off something and then we put a thin bead of caulk to seal up that edge so paint doesn't go up underneath it. They have special tape today where you don't have to use caulk. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, I'll put a video up here that explains exactly how we tape caulk. But we're gonna do that for every single line except for one in our process and the way that we like to paint. The one line that we actually won't tape caulk is when we're cutting the line between the wall and the ceiling, but only if we're painting the walls. What I mean by that is if we are just painting the ceiling, then we're actually gonna tape caulk. And the reason for that is when you're trying to create that line on the ceiling, remember we're only painting the ceiling, we're not gonna get any paint on the wall. We have found to have the least amount of problems is to actually just tape that line off rather than doing it by hand, because you're fighting against gravity and it just doesn't look as clean and good in our opinion when you do it by hand. But the flip side of that is when we're painting either the walls and the ceilings or just the walls, we're gonna create that line on the wall and we do it by hand, which it's a lot easier because you're going up to it and gravity is working in your favor. Plus, the way the eye sees that line and the way you're looking up, I don't know if it's an optical illusion or what, but that line tends to look really clean and crisp when you're cutting it on the wall that way. All right, so with that concept, right, if we're doing the walls and the ceilings, like I mentioned before, we're gonna cut that line a certain way. Versus if we're just doing the ceilings, we're gonna cut that line a different way with tape caulking versus freehand. And there's a different standard for those two different methods. When we do our estimates, we enter the measurements and come up with a price right there. And we offer the client the opportunity to just sign up right then and there. That does two huge things. One is it tends to increase your booking rate or your closing rate or the number of estimates that turn into jobs. But almost just as important, if not more important, is it makes estimating a lot easier. You don't want to have homework. You don't want to have to go home and crunch numbers and submit it later. You just, hey, when you go out to do estimates, you're going out to work. When you get home, you're done. And just psychologically, that makes the job of estimating so much more enjoyable. It's way more efficient. And if you haven't tried that, trust me, if you're able to accomplish that and do that, I think you'll find that it's just way better in every way. Now, I know there's a lot of different ways of estimating and doing things, but there's two main reasons why I think this is the best way to estimate. And the big one is because we want to have our margins a fixed percentage that we can plan on. So what I mean by that is if you want to make profit, right, you ideally would want to make the same profit on every job. What I mean by that is, let's say you make 20% net profit. You'd want to make 20% on this job, on this job, on this job. In reality, what might happen is you made 10% on this job, 30% on this job, 15% on this job, yada, yada. And then you average it out at the end of the year and it's like, okay, I made this much profit. But it's actually when you look at it job to job all over the place, you want to avoid that as much as possible so that you can actually plan what's going to happen. Because if you plan to make 20% and you go buy something expensive thinking you're going to make that and then you don't make that, again, you could go out of business, bad things can happen. So a lot of people ask me like, why would you mark up the materials? And that's why, because, you know, if you quote somebody at the cheapest paint you can get and then you upgrade them to the most expensive paint, I understand the idea of like, well, I'm going to make the same amount on the job in terms of a dollar amount. Like I'm going to make, just to keep it simple, $100, whether I'm doing the cheapest paint or the most expensive paint. But the percentage, that $100 divided by the price you charged, that is not going to be the same. It's going to be a different percentage. Your percentage is actually going to be less if all you do is add the difference in the price of paint. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can totally do that, not a big deal. It just makes it easier to plan for the future. In my opinion, the other reason why that's better is it makes it easier to identify and understand what's going on and why jobs are different. You know, it's easier to see like, okay, these jobs are at a different percentage. And if I have a fixed percentage, I can know like, okay, something is different about this job than this job. And identifying and adjusting that is a lot easier. Another thing is, something I totally recommend you should do, it's super easy, is you should track every single job. You can do it in QuickBooks with projects. You can do it on a spreadsheet and just put in, you know, price, labor, materials, any other cost. But you can also have a column where you adjust for discounts. So you could put in the discount and then have it adjust for that so you can get a better idea of like, are all the jobs coming out to the same percentage? And if not, why? And that's the key, that feedback loop of understanding why. That's when you learn, oh, painters aren't painting at the same rate. Oh, this standard isn't enough. I need to adjust it. And the reason I chose slightly below average for an experienced painter is it's just really good for whether I'm using subs or employees as a number, because for a sub, they want to be making more than the average painter. It's why they're a sub usually. And they're usually good and experienced. So it's like, hey, look, I'm paying this much per chunk of time. And they find that that's a good amount because they can make a good amount painting. And then on the employee side, just another little side note. For me personally, we use subcontractors on exterior residential repaints and we use employees on interior. Big reason is the process. I can say to an employee, I want you to do it this process. I want you to use tape caulking to make those lines. Where with a sub, legally, I can't force them to do that. And even if legally isn't a part of that, it is harder for me to be like, hey, no, you have to do it this way. It's like, why? Dude, I'll do it just as good. Watch, I'll show you. They'll be happy. But that's another little nuance. I've just found it's easier and I have less problems with interior when I'm doing employees on interior. Another quick word of advice is I would use subs as long as you can, and you never have to use employees. I got a whole nother video on subs versus employees, but let's get back to why slightly below average experienced painter is the wage rate. When I'm running employees, it makes it a lot easier for us to, pay them what they're worth. So if I hire a guy and he's pretty green, I can start him off at like $17 an hour and I'm fine because he's going to be even below average that and we make our margin. If they're, a good painter, I can pay him at the wage rate, and we do give bonuses if they finish the job in less hours than what we budget, as long as the quality's there. If we're getting reviews and they're a more efficient painter, they should get more money. And we use that as a recruiting benefit. And naturally what happens over time is, the painters that like to, milk the clock, the person in a group project that kind of just sits back and doesn't really put in a lot, they're not going to want to work here because they're not going to get paid more, and the other painters are not going to like that behavior. Versus if you're somebody who wants to, get paid more for your skill, your experience, what you get done, you're going to love it here because we're going to pay you way more. And after 3 months, if we see, hey, this guy's always coming in above budget, I can easily increase your wage rate. We actually have what we call a performance number, and that goes on every single payroll that we give to our employee painters, and they can see right where they're at. And then we also have a chart that shows them based on their performance number how much of a wage we can pay them. So they're incentivized and have goals. And again, it just kind of creates a culture where it's a win-win. Only the really good, efficient painters that get stuff done like working here. And then it also makes it for us easier on production, and we get really good experienced painters and have less problems. All right, so there's a little bit of experience and information about each one of those things and how I like to estimate and how we bring it all together and do our estimates. If you have some questions, drop them in the comments or shoot me an email. If you want to use my calculator and spreadsheet, it's on my website. If you want to build your own, I give away a lot of my standards for free, so you can get mine and start building your own calculator. Let me know how I did. Is this one of the best resources for interior painting on the internet? If it is, if you like, comment or subscribe. It'll boost this video so that other people can find it and use it as a resource. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this. I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.